They called them devils from the water. The Viet Cong whispered their name in terror. The NVA ordered entire units to avoid the canals at night because of them. But here is what nobody told you. The deadliest threat these warriors faced was not hiding in the jungle. It was not wearing black pajamas. It was not carrying an AK-47. The deadliest threat was wearing a Navy uniform, sitting in an air-conditioned office in Saigon, and signing orders designed to destroy them. I am talking about the United States Navy SEALs, the most lethal, unconventional warfare unit America has ever produced. Men who won every single engagement they fought in the Mekong Delta. And I am talking about the admirals who tried to eliminate them, not the enemy, their own commanders. This is a story the Pentagon buried for decades. A story of barefoot warriors in blue jeans who terrified the Viet Cong, and the brass who punished them for being too effective. You think you know about Navy SEALs in Vietnam? You have heard the legends about the men with green faces? You have not heard this. You have not heard about the classified cable that almost shut down SEAL operations entirely. You have not heard about the weapons the Navy tried to confiscate from its own operators. You have not heard about the missions that commanders ordered and then denied under oath. This is the story of institutional betrayal at the highest level. This is the story of how paperwork became a weapon. How bureaucrats waged war against warriors. How the men who should have been heroes were treated as threats. And this is the story of how those warriors won anyway. Stay with me until the end, because what I am about to reveal will change everything you thought you knew about the secret war in the Mekong Delta. This is the Admiral's betrayal, and the truth is far worse than you imagine. The classified cable arrived at SEAL Team 1 headquarters in Coronado at 0300 hours on a humid September morning in 1968. It carried the signature of a rear admiral stationed 12,000 miles from the Mekong Delta, a man who had never heard the sound of an AK-47 round snapping past his ear, a man who had never tasted the black water of a Vietnamese canal at midnight. And this man had just signed an order that would effectively cripple the most lethal, unconventional warfare unit the United States Navy had ever produced. The order was simple. The SEALs operating in the Rung Sat Special Zone were to immediately cease all _2_. They were to submit detailed after-action reports for every mission conducted in the previous 90 days. They were to provide photographic evidence of every weapon captured. And they were to explain, in writing, why their operators had been observed, wearing non-regulation attire, including blue jeans, bandanas, and in one documented case, no footwear whatsoever. But this was only the opening salvo in a war that would last for years. This was not a request. This was an attack. And the men receiving it understood exactly what it meant. The starched uniforms at Military Assistance Command Vietnam had finally decided to destroy what they could not control. But here is what that admiral did not understand. Here is what the brass in Saigon would never comprehend. Those barefoot operators in their faded jeans had achieved something that 300,000 conventional troops had failed to accomplish. They had made the Viet Cong afraid of the water. They had turned the enemy's greatest sanctuary into a hunting ground. And they had done it by breaking every single rule that the regular Navy held sacred. The real battle was just beginning. The story of how United States Navy SEALs were betrayed by their own high command is not a story that appears in official histories. It is not taught at the Naval War College. It is not mentioned in the sanitized documentaries that air on cable television every Veterans Day. But it is a story that every man who wore the trident during those brutal years carries in his memory like shrapnel that cannot be removed. And it begins not in Vietnam, but in the air-conditioned conference rooms of the Pentagon, where men who had never tasted combat decided they knew better than the warriors in the mud. The institutional war against the SEALs started almost the moment they proved their value. In 1966, SEAL Team 1's direct action platoons began conducting operations that defied conventional military logic. They moved in units of 6 or 7 men, sometimes fewer. They carried weapons that were not in the standard Navy inventory. They refused to file operational plans through regular channels, citing security concerns that regular staff officers found insulting. But their greatest sin was something far more dangerous to the brass, and most damaging of all to the traditional Navy hierarchy. They produced results that made conventional forces look incompetent by comparison. Consider the mathematics that drove the admirals to fury. A single SEAL platoon of 14 men operating in the Mekong Delta for a 6-month deployment could account for more confirmed enemy casualties than an entire Marine battalion conducting search and destroy operations in the same region. The cost differential was staggering. The SEALs required no artillery support, no helicopter gunship cover, no massive logistical tail. They slipped into the darkness with their faces painted green. They accomplished their mission, and they vanished before the enemy knew they had been hit. This should have been celebrated. This should have been studied and replicated. Instead, it was perceived as a threat, and the admirals were about to make the SEALs pay for their success. The first organized attempt to bring the SEALs under traditional command control occurred in early 1967. A memorandum circulated among the staff of Commander Naval Forces. Vietnam proposed that all SEAL operations be approved in advance by the Riverine Assault Force commander. The memorandum noted with obvious disapproval that SEAL operators had been observed fraternizing with Central Intelligence Agency personnel at locations outside military jurisdiction. It questioned whether Navy personnel should be conducting what it delicately termed '3 without explicit authorization from Saigon headquarters. The memorandum used phrases like '4 and '5. But anyone who understood the bureaucratic language of military politics knew exactly what it meant. The regular Navy wanted to put a leash on its most effective hunters. But the men writing these memorandums had never once put their lives on the line in the operational area they claimed authority over. Lieutenant Commander Roy Boehm, one of the original founders of the SEAL teams, later described this period with characteristic bluntness. He said that trying to explain SEAL operations to conventional Navy officers was like trying to teach algebra to a dog. The dog might sit there and appear to listen, but at the end of the conversation, you had accomplished nothing except wasting your time and annoying the dog. The SEALs had been designed from their inception to operate outside the conventional military structure. They were meant to be surgical instruments, not blunt objects. They were meant to strike targets that regular forces could not reach, using methods that regular forces were not trained to employ. But the Navy hierarchy could not tolerate a unit it did not control. And what the hierarchy could not control, it sought to destroy. The weapon they chose was not court-martial. It was something far more insidious. The weapon of choice was paperwork. Beginning in the summer of 1967, SEAL platoons operating in-country began receiving demands for documentation that would have been laughable if they were not so obviously malicious. One platoon was ordered to provide receipts for all ammunition expended during operations conducted over the previous 3 months. Another was informed that their after-action reports were insufficiently detailed and must be rewritten to include grid coordinates for every position where fire was exchanged with enemy forces. Try to imagine the absurdity of this demand. A 6-man SEAL element has just completed a 4-hour operation in absolute darkness. They have inserted by sampan into a canal system controlled by the Viet Cong. They have crawled through 200 meters of mud to reach an enemy supply cache. They have engaged and neutralized a 4-man guard detail. They have destroyed 3 tons of rice and 200 pounds of medical supplies that would have sustained enemy operations for a month. They have extracted under fire, with 1 man carrying a wounded teammate on his back. And now some staff officer in Saigon wants to know the precise 8-digit grid coordinate where the first round was fired. The SEALs called this '6. They used a more colorful term in private. But they understood exactly what was happening. The regular Navy could not criticize their results, so it attacked their methods. It buried them in administrative requirements that were designed to be impossible to meet. And when the requirements were not met, it used the failure to justify further restrictions on operations. This is how institutions eliminate threats without firing a shot. This is how bureaucracies wage war against their own warriors. And the SEALs were losing. But the brass was about to escalate to a far more dangerous battlefield. The Phoenix program represented both the apex of SEAL effectiveness and the ultimate source of institutional betrayal. Beginning in 1967 and expanding dramatically in 1968, provincial reconnaissance units under CYA direction began conducting targeted operations against the Viet Cong infrastructure. the shadow government that controlled taxation, intelligence, and political operations throughout South Vietnam. SEAL personnel were ideally suited for this work. They were trained to operate in small units without support. They were experienced in night operations. They were comfortable working outside the conventional military chain of command. And they were willing to conduct missions that regular forces refused to touch. The missions were simple to describe and terrible to execute. A provincial reconnaissance unit would receive intelligence identifying a specific enemy operative, a tax collector, a political commissar, a courier carrying documents that could compromise an entire network. The unit would plan an operation to capture or neutralize the target. They would insert by boat or helicopter, move to the target location, accomplish the mission, and extract before enemy reinforcements could respond. But here is what the official histories never mention. Here is the betrayal that still burns in the memories of men who served in these units. The intelligence that drove Phoenix operations was often provided by the very same military hierarchy that claimed to oppose SEAL methods. Commanders who publicly criticized '7, privately requested that specific targets be eliminated. Staff officers who filed memorandums questioning SEAL operational authority simultaneously provided target packages for operations they knew would never appear in official records. They wanted the SEALs to do their dirty work. They just did not want anyone to know they had asked. And when the political winds shifted, these same commanders would deny everything. The hypocrisy reached its peak in early 1969. A congressional delegation arrived in Saigon to investigate reports of misconduct in the Phoenix program. They interviewed military commanders who assured them that United States personnel were not involved in assassination operations. They reviewed sanitized briefing documents that omitted any mention of SEAL participation. They returned to Washington and reported that while the program had certain _8_, there was no evidence of direct American involvement in targeted removal operations. Every SEAL operator in the Mekong Delta knew this was a lie. They had conducted these operations. They had the after-action reports locked in safes that would never be opened for congressional review. They had teammates who carried psychological wounds from missions that officially never happened. And they watched as the same commanders who had ordered these operations testified under oath that they knew nothing about them. This was the betrayal that cut deepest. It was not that the Navy hierarchy opposed SEAL methods. It was that they used those methods when convenient, and then denied any knowledge when accountability was demanded. The SEALs had become disposable instruments, tools to be used and then discarded when they became politically inconvenient. But the institutional attacks were about to reach a new level of viciousness. The incident that nearly destroyed SEAL credibility in Vietnam occurred in the provincial capital of Nha Be in June of 1969. A SEAL element conducting a routine patrol encountered what they believed to be a Viet Cong operative attempting to flee the area. The man was detained and questioned. During interrogation, he provided information suggesting the location of a weapons cache. A follow-up operation was conducted. The cache was not found. What happened next became the subject of 3 separate investigations, 2 courts of inquiry, and a controversy that would haunt the SEAL teams for years. The detained individual was later identified as a civilian with no confirmed connection to enemy forces. His family filed a complaint with provincial authorities. The complaint was forwarded to Saigon, and suddenly, a routine operational decision became a weapon that the Navy hierarchy could use against the entire SEAL program. The brass had finally found the ammunition they needed. The investigation that followed was remarkable for its thoroughness. Investigators interviewed every member of the SEAL element. They reviewed every document associated with the operation. They questioned intelligence personnel, provincial reconnaissance unit advisors, and local Vietnamese officials. They produced a report running to over 300 pages. But here is what the investigators did not do. They did not interview the commanders who had established the operational guidelines that the SEALs were following. They did not question the intelligence officers who had provided the targeting information. They did not examine the policies that required SEAL elements to make life-or-death decisions with incomplete information and no immediate support. They blamed the operators. They protected the institution. And the SEALs learned a lesson they would never forget. The Green Beret Affair of 1969 demonstrated that the betrayal was not limited to Navy SEALs. In August of that year, 8 members of the 5th Special Forces Group were arrested and charged in connection with the neutralization of a suspected enemy agent. The case became a national scandal. The charges were eventually dropped, not because the men were exonerated, but because the Central Intelligence Agency refused to allow its personnel to testify. SEAL operators watched this case with grim recognition. They understood exactly what had happened. Special operations personnel had conducted an operation that was standard practice throughout the theater. They had been betrayed by their own chain of command when the operation became politically inconvenient, and they had been saved only because the exposure of CIA involvement would have been even more damaging than the prosecution of the soldiers. The message was unmistakable. You will conduct the dirty operations we require. You will do so without official authorization, and if anything goes wrong, you will be sacrificed to protect the institution. This is not conspiracy theory. This is documented history. This is the reality that every special operations veteran of Vietnam carries in his memory. But the worst betrayal was still coming, and it would come not from the enemy, but from Washington itself. The final betrayal came not in Vietnam, but in the halls of power back home. As American involvement in the war wound down in the early 1970s, the Navy began a systematic effort to minimize and marginalize the SEAL contribution to the conflict. Official histories were written that emphasized conventional naval operations, carrier strikes, coastal interdiction, riverine combat support. The unconventional warfare mission was treated as an anomaly, a temporary deviation from the Navy's proper role. SEAL veterans returning from deployment found themselves assigned to billets that had nothing to do with their skills. Promotion boards consistently ranked special warfare officers below their conventional counterparts. The message from Navy leadership was clear. The war is over. Your services are no longer required. Return to the regular Navy and forget what you learned in the Delta. Some of the most experienced unconventional warfare operators in American history were pushed out of the service. Men who had conducted hundreds of combat operations. Men who had developed tactics that would later become standard doctrine. Men who had built networks of indigenous personnel that no conventional force could have established. These men were told they had no future in the peacetime Navy. The institution had used them. The institution had betrayed them. And now the institution wanted them gone. But here is where the admirals made their fatal miscalculation. The SEALs who survived Vietnam did not simply disappear. They went on to training commands where they passed their knowledge to the next generation. They wrote unofficial doctrine that circulated among operators even when official channels refused to acknowledge it. They maintained networks of contacts that would prove invaluable when the nation once again required unconventional warfare capability. And most importantly, they remembered. They remembered every administrative attack, every political betrayal, every moment when the institution chose its own protection over the welfare of its warriors. They built a culture of institutional memory that ensured the lessons of Vietnam would never be forgotten, even when the official Navy tried to bury them. The men who wore the trident in Vietnam did something that their commanders never accomplished. They won every engagement they fought. They achieved results that no other unit could match. They developed techniques that would eventually transform American special operations. And they did all of this while their own leadership was actively working to undermine them. This is the true story of the Admiral's betrayal. It is not a story about enemy action. It is a story about institutional cowardice. It is a story about bureaucrats who lacked the courage to support the warriors they commanded. And it is a story about how those warriors prevailed despite everything their own side did to destroy them. But the full scope of the betrayal goes even deeper than what we have revealed so far. The Viet Cong called them, quote, 9, the NVA called them, quote, 10. But the greatest threat the SEALs faced in Vietnam was not the enemy who wanted to eliminate them. It was the institution that was supposed to support them. Consider the fundamental contradiction that defined SEAL operations throughout the conflict. The Navy created these units specifically to conduct unconventional warfare. They were trained to operate outside normal command structures. They were equipped with non-standard weapons. They were authorized to work with intelligence agencies that regular military officers were forbidden to contact. And then the Navy expressed shock and outrage when these men actually behaved unconventionally. This is institutional schizophrenia of the highest order. This is an organization that wanted the results of unconventional warfare without accepting the methods required to achieve those results. The admirals wanted SEALs who would somehow combine the lethality of trained warriors with the administrative compliance of peacetime sailors. They wanted men who would slip through the darkness and neutralize enemy targets, but who would also file their paperwork on time and maintain regulation haircuts. They wanted the impossible. And when they did not get it, they blamed the operators rather than examining their own contradictory demands. The documentary evidence of this madness fills filing cabinets that remain classified to this day. The documentary record of this betrayal remains largely classified even today, but enough material has emerged through Freedom of Information requests and veteran testimony to establish the basic outline of what occurred. In 1968 alone, SEAL elements operating in the Mekong Delta filed over 200 formal complaints about interference from conventional Navy command structures. These complaints documented instances where operations were canceled at the last moment due to concerns about _11_. They recorded cases where intelligence was deliberately withheld from SEAL planners. They detailed situations where SEAL elements were denied helicopter support that was simultaneously provided to conventional units conducting far less critical operations. One particularly damning report, partially declassified in 1993, describes a situation where a SEAL platoon commander was ordered to abort a mission to capture a high-value Viet Cong infrastructure target. The order came directly from the staff of Commander Naval Forces Vietnam. The stated reason was that the operation, the actual reason, as the platoon commander later testified, was that the target had connections to a South Vietnamese official who was providing intelligence to the conventional military command structure. The target was a double agent. The conventional Navy knew this. They ordered the operation canceled because capturing him would expose their own intelligence failure. And they were willing to let a known enemy operative continue functioning rather than admit their mistake. This is betrayal. This is institutional cowardice elevated to policy. And the weapons controversy would reveal even more damning evidence of sabotage from within. The weapons controversy provides another window into the institutional war against SEAL effectiveness. From the earliest days of SEAL deployment to Vietnam, operators recognized that standard Navy small arms were inadequate for the close-range ambush operations that defined their mission. They began acquiring and modifying weapons outside the normal supply chain: Stoner 63 light machine guns, Smith & Wesson Mark 22 suppressed pistols, sawed-off shotguns loaded with double-aught buckshot. These modifications saved lives. They provided a tactical advantage that enemy forces could not match. They represented exactly the kind of innovative adaptation that unconventional warfare demands. And the Navy bureaucracy tried to stop them. In 1967, a directive from the Bureau of Naval Weapons ordered all SEAL elements to cease using _14_ and return to approved weapons systems. The directive specifically mentioned the Stoner 63, which it described as _15 and therefore prohibited for combat use. The SEALs ignored the directive. They continued using the weapons that kept them alive. And they began a long guerrilla war against their own supply system, acquiring weapons through CIA channels, trading with Army Special Forces, even purchasing commercial firearms with personal funds. This should not have been necessary. These men were risking their lives every night in operations that served American strategic interests. The least the Navy could do was provide them with effective tools. Instead, the Navy created obstacles that required operators to become smugglers simply to remain combat effective. But the personnel policies would prove even more destructive than the weapons restrictions. The personnel policies of the Vietnam era represent perhaps the most damaging form of institutional betrayal. The Navy's rotation system, designed for conventional naval operations, proved catastrophic when applied to unconventional warfare. A SEAL operator would arrive in-country with no knowledge of local terrain, enemy tactics, or the intricate network of informants and contacts that made operations possible. He would spend his first weeks simply learning how to survive in an environment unlike anything his training had prepared him for. By the third month, he would begin to achieve real effectiveness. By the sixth month, he would possess knowledge that could not be taught, intuitive understanding of enemy behavior, relationships with local personnel, hard-won tactical wisdom, and then the Navy would rotate him home. His replacement would arrive knowing nothing. The cycle would repeat. The institutional knowledge that makes unconventional warfare possible would be lost again and again, in an endless pattern of waste that served no purpose except satisfying personnel policies designed for peacetime fleet operations. SEAL commanders repeatedly requested extended tours, arguing that continuity was essential to operational effectiveness. They were consistently refused. The Navy system could not accommodate exceptions. The paperwork was designed for 6-month deployments, and so 6-month deployments there would be. This is bureaucratic sabotage. This is getting men lost through administrative inflexibility, and the intelligence failures would compound the damage exponentially. The intelligence failures that plagued SEAL operations deserve particular attention, because they reveal the full depth of institutional dysfunction. SEALs operating in the Mekong Delta required timely, accurate intelligence about enemy locations, movements, and capabilities. This intelligence was supposedly provided through the military's Combined Intelligence Center Vietnam, a joint Army-Navy-Air Force organization that theoretically coordinated all intelligence gathering in the theater. In practice, the intelligence that reached SEAL planners was often days old, derived from sources who had never operated in the actual target area, and filtered through layers of staff officers who had no understanding of unconventional warfare requirements. SEAL platoon commanders learned to treat official intelligence products as suggestions at best, actively misleading at worst. One veteran recalled receiving an intelligence brief that identified a specific canal junction as the location of a major Viet Cong supply cache. His platoon conducted 3 separate operations against the target, finding nothing. On the 4th attempt, they captured a local informant who explained that the cache had been moved 2 months earlier, a fact that the intelligence system had either not detected or not bothered to report. Meanwhile, the CIA was providing far better intelligence to the provincial reconnaissance units it controlled. This intelligence was current, specific, and derived from human sources with direct access to enemy planning. But the CIA would not share this intelligence with conventional military units, including often SEAL elements operating outside CIA-directed programs. The SEALs thus found themselves caught between 2 systems, neither of which served their needs. The military intelligence apparatus was too slow and too conventional. The CIA apparatus was more effective, but deliberately exclusive. And the men who depended on accurate intelligence to survive their missions were left to improvise. But even this was not the full extent of the institutional failure. The medical support failures add another dimension to this pattern of institutional neglect. SEAL operations routinely produced casualties that required specialized treatment. Men wounded in canal ambushes might not reach medical facilities for hours. The injuries they suffered, close-range gunshot wounds, shrapnel from captured grenades, infections from contaminated water, demanded expertise that regular Navy medical personnel did not possess. Yet the Navy made no systematic effort to provide specialized medical support for SEAL operations. Wounded operators were evacuated through the same channels as conventional casualties, which meant delays that could prove fatal. Medical personnel who treated SEAL casualties had no training in the specific types of wounds these operations produced. One SEAL corpsman, interviewed years after the war, described treating a teammate who had been hit by multiple fragments from a booby trap. The man needed blood transfusions, surgical intervention, and evacuation to a facility equipped for complex trauma care. What he received was a helicopter ride to a field hospital staffed by doctors who had never seen wounds like his. Then a transfer to a ship-based facility that lacked the surgical capability to treat his injuries. Then finally evacuation to a hospital in Japan, more than 18 hours after the initial wounding. The man survived, but only because his teammates refused to accept the standard evacuation procedures. They bypassed the regular system, contacted a CIA pilot they knew personally, and arranged a direct flight to a facility that could actually help. They broke every regulation in the book. They saved their teammate's life. This should not have been necessary. This was a failure of institutional responsibility so profound that it borders on criminal negligence. And the training establishment would reveal that the rot extended all the way back to the beginning. The training establishment deserves examination as well, because it reveals how the Navy's institutional hostility to SEAL operations manifested even before operators reached the combat zone. Basic underwater demolition/SEAL training at Coronado, California was designed to produce warriors capable of the most demanding unconventional operations imaginable. The instructors were combat veterans who understood exactly what their students would face in Vietnam. The curriculum was brutal by design, intended to eliminate anyone who could not function under extreme stress. But the training command existed within a larger Navy structure that did not share its values. Administrative staff who processed the paperwork for BUD/S classes were conventional sailors with no understanding of unconventional warfare. Supply personnel who provided equipment were working from inventory lists designed for fleet operations. Medical staff who evaluated candidates were applying standards developed for conventional naval service. The result was constant friction. Training officers found themselves fighting the system simply to maintain standards that they knew were necessary for survival in combat. Class sizes were determined by quotas that had nothing to do with the quality of available candidates. Equipment requests were denied because they did not match standardized inventory codes. Medical holds were issued based on criteria that would have disqualified some of the most effective operators in SEAL history. One former instructor described the training command as, quote, 16. Every class that graduated did so despite the system, not because of it. And the operational restrictions imposed during the war would prove that the hostility only intensified once operators reached the combat zone. The operational restrictions imposed on SEAL elements during the war provide the clearest evidence of institutional betrayal. In 1968, rules of engagement were issued that effectively prohibited the tactics that made SEAL operations successful. Operators were forbidden from engaging targets of opportunity unless they had first obtained radio authorization from a command post that was often out of contact. They were required to announce their presence before entering villages where enemy forces were known to operate, a restriction that would have been suicidal if actually followed. They were prohibited from employing certain captured weapons that had proven highly effective in ambush operations. The SEALs responded by developing what they called, quote, 17 of these restrictions. Radio equipment would mysteriously malfunction at critical moments. Announcement requirements would be satisfied by procedures that technically complied with the letter of the regulation, while completely violating its spirit. Captured weapons would be classified as, quote, 18, that happened to be loaded when enemy contact occurred. This was institutional guerrilla warfare. The operators were fighting two enemies, the Viet Cong who wanted to destroy them, and the bureaucracy that wanted to control them. And remarkably, they won both battles. But the after-action reporting requirements would test even the most creative operators. The after-action reporting requirements deserve special attention because they reveal the full absurdity of applying conventional administrative standards to unconventional operations. A standard SEAL operation might involve insertion by small boat, movement through contested terrain, engagement with enemy forces, and extraction under fire, all conducted in total darkness, in an environment where a single mistake could result in the elimination of the entire element. The operators who survived these missions were exhausted, often wounded, and desperately in need of rest. But the Navy required detailed written reports within 24 hours of mission completion. These reports were supposed to include precise timelines, exact ammunition expenditures, specific coordinates for all significant events, damage assessments for all targets engaged, and evaluations of intelligence accuracy. They were supposed to be written in proper military format, with correct terminology and appropriate classification markings. Try to imagine writing such a report after spending 4 hours crawling through mud, while people tried very hard to end your existence. Try to imagine caring about proper format when your hands are still shaking from the adrenaline of close combat. Try to imagine producing a document that would satisfy staff officers in Saigon when you have not slept in 36 hours and your closest teammate is lying in a medical facility with wounds that may never fully heal. The SEALs learned to produce these reports because they had no choice. But they also learned to include precisely the information that would satisfy bureaucratic requirements, while revealing nothing that could be used against them. The reports became exercises in creative compliance, technically adequate documents that fulfilled administrative obligations without providing ammunition for institutional critics. And the promotion system would prove that even surviving combat was not enough to earn respect from the brass. The promotion system represented another battlefield where the institutional war against SEALs was waged. In the conventional Navy, promotion depends on a combination of performance evaluations, time in grade, and professional development milestones. Officers who want to advance must command ships, serve on staff assignments, and demonstrate mastery of the skills that peacetime naval operations require. SEAL officers did not fit this pattern. They commanded small units, not ships. Their staff experience was often with intelligence agencies, not fleet commands. Their professional skills were valuable in combat, but irrelevant in peacetime fleet exercises. And their fitness reports, written by SEAL commanders, often contained language that conventional promotion boards found incomprehensible. The result was systematic disadvantage in the promotion process. SEAL officers consistently ranked below their conventional peers, regardless of their combat accomplishments. The Navy was sending a clear message. Your service in Vietnam was appreciated, but your future lies elsewhere. Many of the most talented unconventional warfare officers of that generation left the Navy rather than accept careers that would force them to abandon the skills they had developed at such cost. The institution lost expertise that took years to rebuild, and the admirals who drove these men away never seemed to understand what they had thrown away. But the contrast with Army support would reveal just how unnecessary this hostility truly was. The relationship between SEAL elements and conventional Army units provides a revealing contrast to the institutional hostility from Navy command. Army commanders operating in the Mekong Delta quickly recognized the value of SEAL capabilities. They had problems that conventional forces could not solve. Enemy leaders who moved freely through areas that regular patrols could not penetrate. Supply caches hidden in terrain that vehicles could not access. Informant networks that collapsed the moment large units entered an area. The SEALs could address these problems, and Army commanders were willing to cut through bureaucratic obstacles to get SEAL support. Some of the most effective SEAL operations of the war were conducted in support of Army objectives using Army intelligence with Army helicopter extraction. These operations succeeded because Army commanders evaluated SEAL capabilities based on results rather than institutional affiliation. They did not care that the SEALs wore their hair long or used non-standard weapons, or refused to file proper requisition forms. They cared that the SEALs accomplished missions that no one else could accomplish. The contrast with Navy command could not have been more stark. Army officers who had every reason to view the SEALs as outsiders welcomed them as essential assets. Navy officers who should have been their strongest advocates viewed them as institutional embarrassments. This is perhaps the most damning indictment of the Navy's institutional response to SEAL operations. When foreign services proved more supportive than your own hierarchy, something has gone profoundly wrong. And the classified operations would reveal the ultimate depths of institutional hypocrisy. The classified operations that SEALs conducted throughout the war remain partially hidden even today. But enough information has emerged to establish that these operations represented the highest and most effective use of SEAL capabilities, and the most complete abandonment of institutional support. Operations into Cambodia and Laos were officially forbidden. American forces were not supposed to cross those borders. The diplomatic and political consequences of detected incursions would have been severe. And yet SEALs crossed those borders repeatedly, conducting operations that achieved results no other force could have achieved. They did so with the knowledge and approval of commanders who would later deny any such operations occurred. They did so using equipment that had been stripped of identifying markings. They did so understanding that if captured or identified, they would be disavowed by the government they served. This is the ultimate form of institutional betrayal. Send men on operations that serve vital national interests, but make clear that they will be abandoned if anything goes wrong. Use them when convenient, deny them when necessary, and never, under any circumstances, acknowledge the debt that the nation owes to warriors who accepted these terms. But even this betrayal would be surpassed by what happened when the war finally ended. The end of American involvement in Vietnam brought no resolution to the institutional conflict. If anything, the war's conclusion intensified Navy efforts to minimize and marginalize the SEAL contribution. Official histories written in the 1970s mentioned SEAL operations only briefly, and often in ways that suggested they were peripheral to the main naval effort. The awards and decorations earned by SEAL personnel were processed slowly, with citation language that deliberately obscured the nature of their accomplishments. Veterans returning from deployment found that their combat experience was considered less relevant than conventional service for purposes of career advancement. The message was unmistakable. The war is over. The operations you conducted never officially happened. The capabilities you developed have no place in the peacetime Navy. Thank you for your service, but your kind is no longer wanted here. Some SEALs accepted this judgment and transitioned to conventional careers. Others left the Navy entirely, their expertise lost to the service that had trained them. A few, the most stubborn and dedicated, remained in special warfare billets, refusing to abandon the community they had built at such cost. These stubborn few would prove essential in the decades that followed. When the nation once again required unconventional warfare capabilities, it was the veterans of Vietnam who provided the institutional memory and tactical foundation that made rebuilding possible. And that rebuilding would prove that the admirals had failed in their ultimate objective. The ultimate vindication of SEAL methods came not in Vietnam, but in the conflicts that followed. The tactics developed in the Mekong Delta proved directly applicable to operations in Grenada, Panama, Kuwait, Afghanistan, Iraq, and countless locations that remain classified. The weapons that Navy bureaucrats tried to prohibit became standard issue for special operations forces worldwide. The training methods that conventional officers criticized as excessive became the model for elite unit selection across the military. The operational concepts that admirals dismissed as undisciplined became doctrine for an entire generation of unconventional warfare practitioners. The SEALs were right. The institution was wrong. And history has rendered its verdict. But this vindication came at a cost measured in careers destroyed, talent lost, and years wasted fighting institutional battles that should never have been necessary. Every obstacle that the Navy hierarchy placed in the path of SEAL effectiveness was an obstacle that helped the enemy. Every administrative requirement that diverted attention from operations was a requirement that put lives at risk. Every staff officer who prioritized procedure over results was an officer who betrayed the men he was supposed to serve. The debt has never been fully acknowledged, but the warriors remember. The men who wore green faces in the Mekong Delta deserved better than they received from their own Navy. They deserved commanders who understood their mission. They deserved support structures that matched their operational requirements. They deserved an institution that recognized their value, rather than treating them as embarrassments to be managed. They did not receive these things. They received administrative harassment, institutional hostility, and systematic betrayal. And yet they prevailed. They prevailed because they were better than the enemies who wanted to destroy them, and tougher than the bureaucrats who wanted to control them. They prevailed because they built a brotherhood that transcended institutional affiliation. They prevailed because they understood something that the admirals never grasped: that in unconventional warfare, the human factors matter more than the organizational charts. The story of Navy SEALs in Vietnam is ultimately a story of triumph achieved despite institutional failure. It is a story of warriors who overcame not just the enemy, but their own hierarchy. It is a story that should be studied by anyone who wants to understand how military bureaucracies can fail their most effective personnel. And it is a story that continues to shape the special operations community to this day. The current SEAL community carries the lessons of Vietnam in its institutional DNA. Every operator who wears the trident today inherits a legacy of combat excellence achieved against opposition from both enemy forces and friendly bureaucracy. They understand that the institution they serve may not always serve them in return. They have learned to build networks of trust that function independently of official channels. This institutional memory is the greatest gift that the Vietnam generation bequeathed to its successors. It is a gift purchased with blood, frustration, and the bitter experience of betrayal. The admirals who tried to destroy the SEAL program in the 1960s and 70s are gone now, their names largely forgotten. But the community they tried to eliminate is stronger than ever. The methods they criticized are now standard doctrine. The warriors they dismissed as undisciplined rogues are now recognized as pioneers who transformed American military capability. History has rendered its judgment. The operators were right. The institution was wrong. And the men with green faces won. This is the story that the official histories will never tell. This is the story of how the United States Navy almost destroyed its most effective combat unit through institutional cowardice and bureaucratic warfare. This is the story of how brave men survived not just enemy action, but friendly betrayal. It is a story that deserves to be told. It is a story that deserves to be remembered, because the warriors who lived it deserve nothing less. The Mekong Delta is quiet now. The canals where seals once hunted run through peaceful farmland. The villages where ambushes occurred have become tourist destinations. The war that defined a generation has faded into history. But the lessons of that war remain. The lessons about institutional failure. The lessons about bureaucratic betrayal. The lessons about what happens when men who have never faced combat presume to dictate tactics to men who face it every night. These lessons matter because the institutional pressures that nearly destroyed the SEAL program did not disappear with the end of the Vietnam War. They exist in every military organization. They manifest whenever peacetime administrators try to impose conventional standards on unconventional warriors. They threaten effectiveness whenever procedure is valued above results. The men who wore the trident in Vietnam understood these pressures better than anyone. They fought against them throughout their careers. They built a community that could withstand institutional assault, and they passed their hard-won wisdom to the generations that followed. This is their legacy. Not just the tactical innovations, not just the operational successes, not just the enemy casualties. Their true legacy is the institutional memory that protects the current SEAL community from the same betrayals that nearly destroyed their predecessors. The admirals thought they could eliminate the SEAL program through administrative warfare. They were wrong. The SEALs are still here, and they remember everything.